Hi everyone, welcome to Barc's Ecology Club on Northwest Conifers. My name's Misha, I'm the Forest Watch Assistant. As for those unfamiliar with Barc, Barc is a nonprofit whose mission is to transform Mount Hood National Forest into a place where natural processes prevail, where wildlife thrives, and where local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. Since 1999, Barc has organized people from communities around Mount Hood National Forest to keep watch over the ecological conditions of the forest and the actions of the federal agency tasked with managing the public forest, the Forest Service. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Barc for Mount Hood. If you want to get plugged into volunteering, we also have a Zoom volunteer orientation tomorrow night. So you can look on our website or Facebook for more information about that. So we're going to begin with Barc's land acknowledgement statement. As an organization founded by white people in the lineage of the settler colonial environmentalism, Barc understands that our work has been inherently within and empowered by the white supremacist legacy of land theft and the erasure of Native authority over the stolen lands now referred to as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest. As an advocacy organization, Barc maintains relationships with the agencies of the U.S. federal government, which originally implemented the violence, land theft, colonization, and displacement of Indigenous people, including through the creation of the public lands, and which has not corrected these actions. All non-Native people have the privilege to access this land as a direct result of this legacy of violence and injustice. Barc's current staff, board of directors, and volunteers are working to transform the organization to first of all acknowledge all of our implicit participation in the ongoing displacement of Native people by whenever we claim these benefits of this inherited legacy and these unearned privileges. I respectfully invite any Native people here today to have a few minutes now to speak freely about this. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. You can type in the chat if you'd like. I'll just give a few moments for people to do that. As now for all the non-Native people here tonight, I ask that you take the next 2 to 3 minutes to write some instructions, intentions, actions, and next steps for yourself, outlining how you will develop your practice of acknowledgement through action. If you have been to a recent Barc event, you should have your writings from past events. Please get that out and revisit what you had set out for yourself to do. How have you made your intentions concrete? Take this time to reflect on your efforts and update your intention and action plan. So I'll give a few minutes for folks to get the notebook that they used before or just get something else to write with. Now, please set aside your journal and turn your attention away from yourself. And please join me in a moment of respectful silence and contemplation and humility in honor of the original people here tonight across this continent in the past, present, and future. Okay. Thank you all for supporting this important practice and learning. It's important that we all continue to practice acknowledgement through action in all areas of our life. We hope that this practice has oriented you to our work for tonight's event and to Barc's work more generally. We're glad to have you with us for the Ecology Club on Northwest Conifers. I'll go ahead and Gradey, if you want to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for leading that. And thank you everyone for taking the time to engage in this important work. Everybody hear me okay? Thank you people for nodding. We today are going to talk about conifers, one of the most predominant trees that we have here in the Northwest. And I try my best to make these as participatory as possible. Last I saw, there's over 50 of us. So we will see how this works. But I do have a lot of questions in here, and we'll just see if we can unmute in this static mania or whether we can use our little, whatever it is, the little write words in the box thing and see what works best for our time today. So we'll just see how this goes. I'll give you a major clue right now. Oftentimes when I do ask a question, on the slide is pictures, which will pretty much tell you the answer to the questions. So there's my hot tip for the evening. So we're starting out talking today about trees, in particular conifers. And can someone say what a conifer is?
Something that has a cone.
Yay! Thank you very much. Yeah, the image there on the right.
Needles.
Right, yeah, those are the two main components there. They tend to be evergreen and they produce their seeds inside of a woody cone. The fancy word for that is a gymnosperm, which means naked seed. It is important to remember as we get started here, and we're going to talk a lot about botany from a Western perspective, that we put these plants in boxes because we're humans and we're a little neurotic. We like everything nice and neat and tidy. Nature by no means needs to abide. So we will definitely see conifers that shed their needles, and we will see conifers that make thing that looks more like a fruit than it does a cone. But those are the two main things that we'll see that make up a conifer in our area. Just to add one more little bit here, these are the little staminate cones. These are what produce the pollen. And you'll see these generally when you just start sneezing in conifer forests, July and August. You'll just see pollen like wafting through the air, and it is derived from these little cones. So conifers have this unique situation where they have two different kinds of cones. They have these staminate cones, which release pollen, and these larger woody cones, which we saw in the first slide, which are the seed-bearing cones. So they have two separate flowers, but on the same plant. And all conifers, to the best of my knowledge, are wind pollinated. Here's a bigger question. I always like to think about, when we're thinking about plants, a lot about the why, because I think that's what's most interesting when we get into ecology. And maybe not the best phrased question here, but why are conifers the main tree in the Northwest? Or perhaps I should put it, why do we have conifers here on the western side of the United States, whereas in the east, it tends to be more deciduous for us at this latitude? Anyone have some ideas?
Well, rain has got to be one of them.
There you go. Thank you very much. Rain. But when do we get our rain?
In winter.
Right. So if you imagine here in the Northwest, if you're a deciduous tree or like a maple or oak or what have you, you know, it's like May, it's April, it's May, it's June, you know, you're like putting on your leaves, you're going to try to make babies. You're doing all of this work, and then all of a sudden you go into a drought, right? We don't often get rain July, August, September. So right when the plant is going into its prime and all of a sudden it's a period of drought, that can be really hard on a tree to be able to maintain itself. So our conifers have ways around that. And one of the ways is just to be massive. If you have an extremely large bole or stem of the tree, you can store a significant amount of water. Other studies that are really fascinating to me have shown that trees can actually harvest moisture out of the air, right? Those needles can get fog drift. So those needles, you know, say those redwood trees that are 300 feet in the air, they don't have to expend the energy of lifting water out of the earth and carrying it all that distance and feeding their leaves. Their leaves are able to hydrate themselves just out of the moisture that's floating in the air. Just pretty fascinating to me. And some studies have shown too that our conifers will actually put on more growth in the winter months than in the summer months. Because as long as the ground isn't frozen, you know, these trees can take up moisture. They're evergreen, so they can do their work any time of year. As long as the ground isn't frozen, they can pull up moisture, they can do their thing.
I just want to be able to discriminate between them.
Cool. We'll talk about that today. It'd be so much more fun and easier if we were out hiking in the forest together, but these are the times and here we are. So hopefully this will be enough to get us started though. I will drop a really valuable way to learn the trees instead of like, as we're doing this evening, watching TV. There's a fabulous book out, and maybe you can see it in here. It's called Trees to Know in Oregon. Ooh. It's pretty much exactly what that title suggests. It's the major trees that grow in Oregon. But you can take this book and you can go up to the Arboretum up by the zoo and go for a hike. And you can find a Douglas fir, for example, and you can find a Douglas fir that even has a name tag on it. And you can take out your Trees to Know in Oregon book and read through all the features that they list and see if you can find them on your plant. This is a really great way to spend a day out in on the world and being sure of your tree ID, because they've had experts out there putting little plaques on all these signs.
Worst comes to worst, you could always use my tattoo. So, you know, just grab KJ's arm and you'll figure out what a Doug fir is.
Excellent. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Whoops. So, but these are some of the reasons that I think conifers are pretty awesome, or getting to know your trees in general. One of the things is what, you know, we call like plant association, which is basically like who likes to grow with who, right? And so as we'll learn tonight, you know, these trees all have a different story to tell. And so maybe we're out ground truthing with bark, and the Forest Service shares that there's what's called a great fern, it's Botricium genus, and it's associated with wet areas. And so we're driving up logging roads trying to find these ferns. And sure, we could pop out and, you know, scour the entire forest. But if we're looking for trees that tell that story of wet, like, for example, the Western Red Cedar, as we'll see, we're going to be more likely to find ferns with trees that like it wet, like a Western Red Cedar again, than we would with like a Lodgepole Pine that likes really dry, rocky soils. So the trees just being the big, obvious thing in the landscape can really help us hone in those littler things that we might be seeking in a landscape. Mushrooms. Who doesn't like mushrooms, right? So a lot of fungus are associated with very specific trees. So if you wanted to find a chanterelle, for example, you should be walking amongst Douglas fir trees and not on the east side, like walking around in Ponderosa pines. So a lot of times, very specific things will like very specific trees. We could say the same about plants, animals, lichens, mosses, etc. And ecology, or the story of place, much the same there, but all the plants have a story to tell. And the trees just being the big dominant feature in the landscape can be a really, really useful tool. And, you know, we can learn a lot even about the past of a place. Like there are certain trees that love to come in after a fire, or there's certain trees that come in after a flood. There's certain trees that are just going to chill in the shade of larger trees for hundreds and hundreds of years, just waiting for their moment to rise and become the dominant tree in the overstory. So by knowing the components of a forest, we can learn a lot about the history of a place as well. So how we're going to roll tonight is we're going to break apart our tree ID into these broader categories of bark, cone, needles, profile, and then we'll end with a little discussion about the ecology. And that's where we can have some conversations. I'll probably have a little story to tell maybe about some of these plants, and I'd be delighted to hear what you have to share too, because I'm not here to yak. I want to learn some stuff tonight too. So let's jump into trees. We'll start with this one, and I'll share right away. If you joined and you're just like, I don't know if I'm really into this tree thing, I don't know. And you're out on a hike and you want to impress your friends, and you come across a random conifer, and you know your buddy asks you, who is that tree? You can pretty safely say Doug fir, and you're going to be right. It's almost 80% of the conifers that are in Oregon are the Doug fir. So that's some pretty darn good odds. So if you know it's a conifer, this is the most predominant tree that's in our area. It's the most sought after lumber tree too. So, you know, it's also in a lot of those tree plantations and things like that. This is going to be the thing they're planting. Cool. And this is first it's bark. I feel like bark is maybe one of the harder ways to get to know the trees, but this is what's at our face level, right? Some of the other features like the needles, like we might need our binoculars. We might have to look 200, 300 feet up in the air to see what those needles look like. But the bark is the thing that's right there. And Doug fir has this very thick furrowed bark. You can often just kind of stick your hand in one of those little fissures and get lost. Like your whole hand can disappear in there. Things like bats and such will like roost in these little cracks in there. So it's a very thick barked tree. They're kind of this grayish color on this side of the mountain. Sometimes when they're hanging out with the Ponderosa Pines and drier forests, they can have a little bit more of a reddish color to them. But they'll have this in both regards. On a mature tree, you're gonna have this really thick bark. Here's a close-up of the needles. And this picture doesn't illustrate it really well, but the needles, they go around the branch like a bottle brush, right? So you have some needles that are sticking straight up. You have some needles that kind of go out to the side. They're going around in all the different directions, right? So we've got needles going every which way. And here's those cones. So like, yeah, when you're doing plant ID, so much of the idea is about the flowers. When we're doing conifer ID, the best tool, if we can see it, are the cones. The cones are, yeah, just the most distinct thing. And definitely here with the Doug fir, this is a really, really unique cone. If you look here amongst the scales, grab a little pin, you can see that there's these little scales here. I'm gonna draw the line across here. And when these things open up, there's like seeds in between them. The seeds are down in this little area here. There's a little baby plant. And then in between there are these cool little 3-pronged bracts. And that's going to be really unique. You'll see some single-pronged bracts on some other conifers here in a little bit, but this little split into 3 is really unique for the Doug fir. And so, yeah, again, if you can see a cone of a conifer, that's going to be your best tool. That's going to be the most unique aspect on a tree, on a conifer, I should say. So yeah, see if you can get your hands on those. That's going to be the most distinct thing. And a lot of folks will say that these look like the butt of a mouse, the back 2 legs, and then we've got the tail, that longer appendage there coming out the backside. I know someone is dying to share right now, and I want to drink some water. So who's ready for story time? Who wants to tell a story about Doug fir?
They are not a true fir.
They're not a true fir, absolutely. So that's an important thing. We see that Doug and then that hyphen fir or Douglas fir. So they're not a true fir. We'll get into the true firs here in a wee bit, but the Latin name here is Suga, and that kind of reflects that unknown quality there. The next tree we'll see is a Suga. That's their genus. And Suga means like a hemlock, but it's not a hemlock. The common name Douglas fir, but it's not a fir. So it's had a lot of different names, and it's kind of in its own little group. It's got a few other relatives in that Suga genus, but it's not really related to the pines or the true firs. So yeah, it's in its own little genus there.
So you mentioned that there are 80% of trees are Douglas fir, but I wonder if fire suppression were not a thing, if that number would be way lower. So it's not really a story, but just kind of a thought that I imagine the percentage of Douglas fir might be much less than 80% pre-Euro-American settlement.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, here in the valley, in the Willamette Valley, when fire was used as a management tool by indigenous peoples, like it was oak savanna. And then after settlement, a lot of that area started getting, the conifers started to encroach. So a lot of the valley, we had a lot of Doug fir replacement of the oak savannas. So yeah, that's a really good observation. And it's also like, a lot of plantations are filled with Doug fir too. So that's going to be a huge, part of that number as well.
Yeah, that's interesting you mentioned that. There's a lot of studies on the effects that Doug fir have as far as like taking over as primary growth, and especially in these areas that have been burned by wildfire, they kind of bully everything. And what they do is they suck up a lot of the water because of how these trees operate. And they basically work as big old sponges, and they steal everything from everybody else and just kind of bully everything out of the way. So I would imagine that it should and would be less.
The Douglas fir is a sun lover. It's one of the first trees to grow in an open field.
I love that. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We'll see some trees like they're what we call shade tolerant. So basically, if you're going to plant a seed of that tree, it needs to be in the shade of other conifers, and they're going to grow slowly in the shade of other trees. Whereas Doug fir, they need to be established like after a fire or something like that. Those babies need to grow up in the sun, and they'll grow quick and become the first conifers on the scene here at lower elevations anyways. Yeah.
Also, I think that the Doug fir doesn't grow above a certain level, like 4,000 feet or something like that. You know, the 80% is only applicable down low.
Yeah, that's a great observation too. Yeah, it may be more like 5.5 or something, you know, depending. And then, you know, of course, if you're on the east side of Mount Hood, you know, then there's going to be, you will still see Doug firs on the east side of Mount Hood, but it's not going to be as high too. So mostly what I was referring to is just statewide, based on the numbers. Yeah.
I have two brief stories about Doug firs. One's very recent, from about a month ago. We've been trying to see a lot of the Portland heritage trees, and it's really fun. And we went and saw the one in the Audubon Society property. It's a fun little walk, and you can see a giant Doug fir. You guys should go. Other brief one is growing up, there was just one of those giant Doug firs in the forest firehouse outside of Seattle. One of those ones that like 10 people could walk arms and still not reach all the way around it. And it toppled in a windstorm. And that was one of the most significant things I remember from my whole childhood, this tree, this giant tree. So those are my Doug fir stories.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Heritage Tree Program is great. I think the other Heritage Doug fir in Portland is at Powell Butte, which is a pretty lovely park too. Awesome. Well, I was trying to cut slides, but I couldn't do it, people. I love dead trees. But I'm going to keep it short. Dead trees are really important. So I want you to look into that, do your homework. A snag, or what we call a standing dead tree. These dead trees are more important to ecosystems than a living tree. Secondly, the first thing we lose, if we're going to be logging in an area, they're considered a hazardous tree. If they're in a campground, everyone's like, oh my God, it's going to crush my doggy or whatever. So these are the first things that are often lost in our forests. And it takes a tree as long to live as it does to die. And I think that's amazing for thinking about a Douglas fir that can live for 1,000 years. Maybe for 500 years, it could be this standing dead tree. And for 500 years, it's, habitat for so many birds. And then, it's going to hit the ground. Well, this one didn't quite make it. But the tree will fall and it'll hit the ground, and maybe another 500 years, it's slowly decomposing, providing habitat for a whole bunch of different critters, including, grab my pen. What is going on right here on this downed log?
Baby trees.
Baby trees. Yeah. So this was my excuse to keep these two slides in there, because some trees like to grow up. This is like an ideal nursery bed for some particular trees, like these lovely Western hemlocks. These Western hemlocks and some huckleberries and plants like that love to get started on these nurse logs or these downed logs. As they start to decay, it's a really moist substrate for certain plants to get established in. If you ever find a down log on the ground in September, it hasn't rained for like 3 months, you can still reach in and grab some of that punky wood and you can squeeze water out of it. So it makes a really ideal situation for a lot of these baby trees, in particular the Western hemlock. Because the Western hemlock, unlike the Doug fir, is a tree that's going to grow slowly in the shade of the Doug fir forest. And it's going to just, grow inches a year. And it's just sitting there waiting for those firs to eventually die. And then they can rise up into the forest canopy. And eventually they might be what we call the climax species, or the species that, ultimately end up, in the top layer of the canopy. Meant to do ID stuff first, but I got into ecology there. I got excited. One of the timber sales that Barc worked on back in the day, it was called Gordon Creek, and it's up Larch Mountain Road. And it's a predominantly Western hemlock forest. And so all the standing dead trees are Douglas fir that are in there. And there's just like these giant 400 or 500 year old Western hemlock trees. which is really a rarity, that we think about, as I described it, the Western hemlock can be the climax species. So, if a forest is left alone for, 500 years or something like that, those Doug firs start to come down and they get replaced by Western hemlock trees, right? But that's pretty rare in our ecosystem because the Western hemlock trees, as we'll see in a minute, have a really thin bark to them. So they're not as fire hardy as like a Doug fir. If you see a big old Doug fir tree that's, 1,000 years old, it'll have multiple fire scars all over it. Western hemlocks, they're going to get burnt up in there. So it's pretty uncommon to find forests, these climax forests that are just predominantly Western hemlock. So anyways, if you're ever out exploring and you're looking around, you're like, whoa, it's mostly Western hemlock here. You're likely in a place that's, been free of fire and logging and all of that for many, many years. Yeah. So anyways, got excited. Forgot to talk about ID stuff, but this is Western hemlock, and this is a close-up of the needles. And we'll see in the next slide the spelling for this, but the Latin name for it is Suga Heterophylla, and the species name Heterophylla means needles of different lengths. So if you find some Western hemlocks and you look closely at the needles, you'll see there's some needles that are about 1 inch long and some are 1/2 inch. So maybe you can kind of see that here in the slide. They have needles of various lengths. Here's their cones. The other thing is if you're hiking the trail and you look down and you're like, oh my God, there's like 1 million cones all over the forest floor, it's probably a Western hemlock. They can start bearing cones as young as I think it's like 10, 15 years in age, and prolific. Even those little ones in the understory that, like 20 feet tall, they'll just be loaded with cones. Yeah, really a profuse cone bearer, and they'll start at a really young age too. Here's that bark. Maybe got a little too close up in this photo, but it's a really a thin bark. You're not gonna be able to stick your fingers and get lost in and amongst those cracks. It's really a thin bark. It does, so you can see it kind of cracks as it matures, but it's not gonna get those deep fissures. It's not gonna get that depth that a Douglas fir tree would get. And I'll put in profile pictures when it's useful. And this is really super helpful here. This is, again, the Suga Heterophylla, the Western hemlock tree. And if you notice that top part, you notice how it's not erect, it kind of flops over. And this is really common for members of the Suga genus. All the hemlocks have what we call a droopy leader. So instead of just being like, that straight up, the top part kind of flips over. I'm kind of imagining it like Doug fir is like race to the top, right? A lot of those conifers that come in after a fire, they just want to get bigger than everybody else first. So they're going to grow tall really fast. And plants like the Western hemlocks, they're a little more relaxed. They're taking their time. So they got that leader that's kind of flopped over a little bit, just slowly growing, right? Just a little bit at a time. Just waiting for, again, those Doug fir and other trees in the overstory to start to come down via fire, disease, things like that. And then they could replace those trees in time. So these would be, again, what we call our climax tree here at lower elevations in our area. But again, we have too many natural disturbance, fire, logging, things like that, that it's pretty rare that we see pure stands of Western hemlock forests. All right, I have to tell a story first on this one. This is Western red cedar, and here we're looking at a close up of that really stringy bark here. And I've been volunteering with Barc for a little while now. I think it was like 2004, 2005 or something like that. And it was one of the first times I really went out and did this thing we call ground truthing, which if you're not aware of that, that's just like when the Forest Service plans a timber sale, it's basically just getting boots on the ground to see if like what they say meshes with reality. And so we were going to check out this sale. It's called the Hilip timber sale. It was managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and had some fish issues. There was anadromous fish, so salmonoids that were in this lower waterway. And so we had kind of prioritized checking out wet areas when we were looking at the timber sale. And so to get down to the wet area, we had to park at the top of the ridge. And our plan was to hike down slope, you know, to get down to the riparian area, down along the creek side. And so we were all excited. I'm pretty new to plants. I just, you know, took a couple years and took botany courses down in Eugene. And so I'm at the top of the slope and I'm like, sweet, we got to find the Western Red Cedars because they're going to, you know, show us when we're getting close to the water. And so we're at the top of the slope. We're only like 100 yards from the car or something like that. And all of a sudden I see a Western Red Cedar. And I'm like, oh, shit. Oh, excuse me. I'm like, oh, darn, I'm doing this wrong, right? I'm like, why is there a Western Red Cedar way up here at the top of the ridge, right? So, you know, I was with my buddy and we stop and we're pondering. We're like, what's the deal? And he points out, he's like, look, there's another tree, like another Western Red Cedar right there, right? So we start walking towards that and we're like, okay, here's another one. What's going on? And then a little further down slope was another one, and then another one, and then another one. And then guess what emerged from the earth?
Mushrooms?
No. This is the
Spring.
sign. It's helpful. Yes. Yeah. So there's water. Water was coming out of the earth and there was a spring, right? And so we were at the very top of that spring, right? It was underground and the water was coming down that hill slope and the Western Red Cedars knew it, right? They like to grow in wet environments. So Western Red Cedars were tapped into that area. And that waterway was going underground for, I don't know, a good couple hundred yards before it emerged and became like an actual stream. And so none of that was mapped, you know, on that particular timber sale and in that particular area that they were planning on logging. And so this, you know, stream would have been logged over. They would have been driving bulldozers over this thing and like, it would have massively disrupted that water. And that, even though that was a smaller seasonal creek, it went right down into a major creek that contained salmon, right? So this would have been really detrimental for those fish. And so it was really amazing for me to be like, whoa, these plants have a story to tell. And if we sink into it and see what, you know, the place is telling us, what the trees are telling us, like we can learn so much. And it was really empowering because they ended up putting 150-foot buffers on both sides of that waterway in order to protect that creek. So we didn't get that timber shell dropped or that area dropped, but we did get a buffer put on that waterway. So it felt really empowering to be like, whoa, you just walk around and see what the plants have to share and change management. This is freaking amazing. So I love Western Red Cedar. I think about them a lot in that context. And it's really anything, right? If you just, anything you're out there in the world and you see it, just ask yourself why and just sit with that discomfort until you figure it out, you know? I know we live in the age of like Googling things and like push buttons and then magic, but you know, what does that really mean? Right. So I love Western Red Cedars for that. There's that long stringy bark again. Needles, quite a bit different, right? The needles to me, like I imagine like French braiding other needles and then pressing them in a book. They have this really plated or braided look to them, kind of fan shaped. So very different, not the long, slender needles that we'll see out there. And in our area, this is really the only one that has this kind of manifestation. A little bit south of us, we start to see incense cedar. If you went a little bit north, you'd see Alaskan white cedar. And so those could get confusing when you see that. But if you stick to like Mountain National Forest and you're seeing this kind of pattern, it's going to be a Western Red Cedar. And with them, I think it's less about sun and shade, you know, as far as that seedling getting established, and more just about wet, right?
They're flat.
Yeah, needles are really flat. Yeah. Flat and braided.
In the chat, Caitlin asked how Western Red Cedars do in wildfires.
Yeah, I'm not sure of their fire resiliency, like based on their bark, but I think they choose wisely in growing in wet drainages where, you know, maybe fire is less prone to move through. But yeah, I'm not sure like how resilient the bark of the tree is to fire. I would suspect somewhere in between, like a Doug fir and a Western hemlock. I don't know if anybody else has more on that.
Actually, yeah, you touched on it right when you first were talking about identifying it. That's the thin bark. They do really pour.
Okay. Yeah.
I actually think that they're more of a medium
Right.
based on some recent studies that I just read.
I'd
I mean,
buy
they're
that.
old studies, but from the
I'll
70s.
rescind and say middle to poor.
Middle of the road.
Middle of the road.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, up in when in the gorge burn up Joaquina Falls, all the cedars up there did just fine, and on both sides it's charred. So there's
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Did you notice anything with the topography? Was it like, maybe like in a gully or, kind of in a wetter area or anything like that?
Yeah, dip down for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that might be part of it too, is like, choosing those wet areas is going to help, slow fire down a little bit for them too. But yeah, they're pretty thin. That bark is like, sometimes they'll kind of just peel off in these long strips. But yeah, it seems pretty thin. Cool. And here's those cones. I honestly don't see them on the tree that often. I feel like I see the cones more often in like when these are planted in people's lawns than I do up in the forest. But excuse me, this is what they would look like if you could find them. I think they look like a little wooden rosebud, if you will. Pretty darn cute. So if you did find an incense cedar or an Alaskan cedar, I would really be looking at cones to figure out who is who. That's going to be our best tool. There's distinctions with the foliage too, but I don't recall offhand how you can tell there. It's like a lot of that patterning. And this one has this nice, you can see those like white lines in there underneath on the foliage itself. Here's a profile. I didn't like the pictures that I could find, so I put it on there twice for you. But the profile is really useful tool. I wish this did it better. They have what's called the J-shaped branching pattern. So the branches kind of, oh God, what is happening? Sorry about that. So the branches kind of come off in this J pattern where they kind of swoop down, and then at their tips, they kind of flare up, right? So they kind of do that number. Whee! I am not very good at drawing. Do you know what I mean though? Is this at all like that? I could keep doing the same thing crappily and then we could pretend. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Gradey. So it's something like that. The other thing with the Western red cedar is the base of them get really big, right? A lot of times with most of our conifers, the Doug fir and the Western hemlock, they're about as wide coming out of the ground as they are, 100 feet up in the air, right? But Western red cedar has those really buttressed roots, really widespread roots, which to me makes a lot of sense. If you're growing in those mountain streams, they're subject to a lot of erosion and things moving around a lot more than maybe more stable soils that Doug fir and Western hemlocks are accustomed to. So it makes sense to have a firm base to really like clasp onto the ground. Let's see. Yeah, this was pretty rad. I learned that in the Olympic National Forest, they've aged some trees to be 1,500 years in age. So it's a very, very old tree. And it makes sense if you ever look at the bark of a Western red cedar, there's nobody growing on it, hardly at all. Like if you look at the bark of the Doug fir, or, Western hemlock, there's mosses and lichens, all kinds of things growing on it. But Western red cedar, that bark, it really attests to how much it inhibits fungal growth and bacterial growth, things like that. And you can, dig into the ethnobotany of it and even into the medicinal uses of it, and you'll see so much reflection of that, it being used as an antimicrobial, antifungal, or being used to make canoes because it's so slow to rot and decay and things like that in really wet climates. Cool. Other stories or additions folks want to add to our friend Western red cedar here?
I always like to think of it as the sequoia's cousin, because they are in the same. They're both Cupressaceae, but every time I see it, I remember. I'm like, oh yeah, you should have a whole bunch of your cousins living next to you, but you don't.
Yeah, they are kind of a little isolated here. And I'm glad you bring that up too. The other thing that maybe is worthy of note is that a lot of times they're in the false cedar family. Cedar means aromatic wood, and so if someone said a cedar tree, like they're talking about hundreds and hundreds of different plants. Cedar means aromatic wood. So if you got smelly wood, you can be a cedar too. So, you know, if someone did share that, like you'd want to dig into it a little bit more to figure out what they're talking about. But yeah, cedar, words like sage are kind of useless. So make sure you get in that Western red cedar, or the Latin name is there as well, Thuja plicata. I think that was like a Jimmy Buffett song, right?
There's a nice stand of 800-year-old cedars at Opal Creek. There's a trail that goes right up to them. Really nice.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning those. That's this is Caitlin. That's the, when I think of red cedars, I think of that section. It's so special. And so that's why I was actually wondering about the fire, how fire resilient they are because of, oh, sorry about the dog. Because of the Beachy Creek fire. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of terrain we can explore to get more information there right now, right? So see how cedars fare.
I believe that I had read in the Pojar that given time, the cedars will outgrow the Douglas firs, that they're the final tree of the succession of the forest. Is that accurate? Does that sound accurate to you?
In a wetter place, I think if the forest was a little bit drier, I think you might see Western hemlock replace Doug fir instead. But definitely, I mean, Western red cedar is a very long-lived tree. And so I could see definitely spots where, you know, the Doug firs kind of set the scene up and then it gets shady. And I've seen Western red cedar doing fine in the shade of the Douglas fir. So it makes sense if the soil was wet enough that the Western red cedar would, you know, move out maybe at just those riparian areas and take up some of those wetter places where maybe Doug fir did rain.
Actually, I think maybe it wasn't in the Pojar. I think maybe I read that in a sign in the Susa law, which maybe would the Coast Range be like wet enough for you that, or you're saying like in the farther north?
Yeah, maybe in the Coast Range, you know, because we're getting just a lot more rain kind of year round. And like I mentioned, especially those coastal trees are really adept at harvesting that fog rolling off the sea. So it would make a lot more sense to me in a coastal forest like in the Siuslaw, where Western red cedar may and eventually replace them. Yeah. But yeah, I think if it was a little bit drier, you'd see Western hemlock predominantly. And I have also seen places where they'll clear cut, or, you know, they'll log an area and they'll log out all the Douglas fir, and they don't quite destroy all of the Western hemlock in the understory. So I've seen some really young Western hemlocks and then just some stumps of Doug fir here and there. So sometimes that succession thing gets thwarted via logging. So I've seen just a handful of spots where that was the case, where it's been hemlock forest just because of logging.
Cool. It's me, heritage tree guy, one more time. my story about cedars is we were trying to identify a couple trees that were in our neighborhood. We had no idea what they were, couldn't figure it out. And we finally identified them as a cedar. And yeah, we learned what true cedars were. So like the Lebanon and Deodar and all, and have been so shocked at how common they are in the city.
Yeah.
More common in the city than a Western red cedar, it seems.
Yeah.
There's so many of them. So that's what I've learned about cedars in the last year.
Yeah. Yeah, the kind that you'll see in this genus, like kind of around town more, is arborvitae. That's Thuja occidentalis, and that's very closely related. The long, slender things people plant to grow fast so they don't have to look at their neighbors. So you'll see a lot of those planted around. But yeah, the true cedars you'll see in the town a lot. They're planted out a lot, but they're not related at all. And if you look at them, very, very different trees. They just both got stinky wood. So there's one tree that I just want to give a quick mention to. This is Pacific yew, Taxus brevifolia. And this tree, like Western hemlock, grows in the shade of other trees, but it never aspires to grow up and be up in the upper canopy. Western yew, 20, maybe 25 feet is as big as it wants to get. So, you know, this is one that's like, is it a tall shrub? Is it a small tree? It kind of walks that line. Yeah, really cool, really unique plant. You can kind of see the foliage there. They're really in this flat plane. The needles are just very flat. They kind of come to a point there, but they're not sharp to the touch. And if you look close at the edges, they kind of roll under. So the edges of the leaves kind of roll under. And then, boy, look at that cone. That's kooky. They make like a little fruit. So it is technically a cone because they're a conifer, but they really found a different way to manifest that. And they got some sexy bark too. That's right up there with the drone, right? That's gorgeous. If you're lucky to see it, you know, oftentimes yew trees are usually denizens in really old growth forests. So they're really generally in a pretty shady place. They're only going to move into a forest when that forest is a good 100 years and change. And they're pretty slow growers. So if you're walking around and you're seeing some yew trees in the understory, yeah, first you're in an old growth forest. It's a pretty special place. And secondly, if you're into lichens and things like that, like spend some time with those yew trees. You can find a lot of rare and endangered lichens and things growing on yew trees. I think it was in 2000 and sometime like maybe 20 years ago. How about I say that? There was a timber sale called the Solo Timber Sale, and it was mostly old growth, and they were gonna, they were gonna log it, and there was a lot of yew trees in there. And this gentleman, his name's John Valella, and if you ever get an opportunity to do any workshops with him, I highly recommend it. He's very smart. He's a lichenologist, does a lot of survey work. Anyways, he started finding this lichen on this yew tree called the old growth specklebelly lichen, Pseudocephala, Ranieriensis. Anyway, this is a rare species, and the Forest Service had to put buffers around it. And so for every yew tree that had this rare lichen on it, they had to put like, I think it was like a 300, 500-foot buffer around it. And so once he found one, he did a bunch of trainings for Barc staff to go out and volunteers to go out and look for them, and just finding them all over the place. We found dozens of trees yew trees that were in this area. And because of this lichen growing on yew trees, it shut down the Solo Timber Sale. And after that, Mount Hood National Forest didn't propose any old growth logging for like almost a decade. So pretty awesome. I think about that a lot. And so if you're ever out doing work for Barc, which you totally should, go and you're out exploring and you find yew trees, that's a pretty special place to spend some time. You're going to find some cool stuff in there. The other thing I'll mention briefly is I work a lot in the herbal communities, and sometimes people will talk about yew as heart medicine. This conifer is toxic. People make a derivative, a chemical extract from this plant to produce in the lab for conditions probably none of us can treat. So this isn't like herbal medicine at all. This is lab stuff, right? If you were munching on these needles, you get real sick, potentially even die. So don't mess with yew trees. Pretty much all the conifers that are out there, those needles are pretty edible, or you can make tea or do some herbal stuff with them, but not yew trees. So if you're into like foraging and things like that, it's a great time. There's lots of blowdown still out there, but don't mess with yew trees. That's a life or death thing. So always get to know your poisonous plants, and I'm going to put yew tree on that list of toxic plants.
Which is funny because it's heavily foraged as a treat for the animals in the forest. Elk, moose, white-tailed deer, rabbit, and it's also another mention on the thin bark, not fire hardy, for our fire friend that was asking questions.
Yeah. Beautiful tree. Like, go explore them. Cool. We're gonna go up the mountain a little bit. We're gonna move up to middle elevations, and we're gonna talk about some different conifer species. All of our friends are. Yeah, please.
All right, this is Caitlin. Hi, where on Mount Hood do yew trees grow? I've seen them, I think, in the more northern Cascades, but not on Mount Hood.
Yeah, I think that's because we've logged the snot out of it. There's only about 3% of old growth left in Mount Hood, so there's not a lot of habitat for it. It'll grow at low and middle elevations. You might have better luck going up the mountain, let's see. If Oxbow Regional Park has some old growth forest in there, and there's some yew trees in there. So that's probably the closest place I could think of. Hiking some of those trails. There are a couple of yew trees pretty close to the Sandy River. Yeah.
I actually find now that it's easier to find older yew trees at low, more coastal elevations, probably because of the tide and marbled murrelet habitat. So Alcy Falls, which is a little bit farther south of Portland, obviously. I'm blanking on the old growth section on the coast, a little bit farther north. Oswald maybe, but there's, I think it's a little bit easier to find the yews currently lower elevation in the marbled murrelet habitat.
Good to know. Yeah. There's a little more old growth at middle elevation. So I feel like I have better luck there in the Mount Hood National Forest. But yeah. And then on the coast, I'm not sure like how close. There's that salt tolerance is a variable when we're talking about conifers on the coast. So, but yeah, I've definitely seen them in the Siuslaw forest down in there, but I can't recall like how close to the water, but yeah. But they're around, just not as plentiful, I imagine, as they once were. So yeah, those 4 trees that we talked about will kind of creep up into middle elevations too. But as we're going to see, we got a lot more things coming on the scene now, including the true firs. Dun, dun, dun. So these are in the Abies genus, and so they're not related to Doug fir. Distantly they're related, but they're in a very different genus. Yeah, so here's some of their traits. In a lot of the true firs and Abies, the cones sit upright in a tree. So I definitely had this experience, like the first time meeting a noble fir, I'm like, whoa, there's an owl party or something in the tree. There's like 20 owls up there. And it's not, their cones are just, can be really big and they sit upright. Most conifers, their cones are dangly things. And they're going to remain on the tree. They don't generally fall down unless a squirrel knocks them down. The way that the tree would naturally shed them, like we saw those conifers have the scales. Most of them, the whole thing comes down. The firs will just shed those scales one at a time, unless, picked apart by a squirrel. So sometimes you'll just see a little spire, like a little candle poking up where those scales once were. So much around them, there's roundness too. Like you see here, if you remove a needle, it leaves a circular scar. The buds, the leaves to be, or the tip of the stems, those buds are quite round. For example, the Douglas fir, the buds have a pointed tip to them. And the way a lot of folks describe the firs is they say friendly firs because the needles are blunt tipped. Most conifers, the needles will come to a point. They may or may not be like sharp to the touch, but they'll come to a point. And as we'll see here with most of the firs, they're more rounded off. And here's a picture of those resin blisters. So if you've been out in the forest for a week and then, I don't know, you're going to stop in Estacada and get some breakfast and you're worried you're going to smell and they're not going to serve you food, you could pop some of these and smear them on you and you smell just fine. And you'll just see these on the trees in that 30 to 80 year range. In time, they're going to kind of break up and they might look more like this. This was from last summer in a timber sale called Grasshopper. And this is a noble fir. And noble firs at middle elevations will join Doug fir being those shade intolerant trees, meaning that it's after a fire, after logging, etc. They're going to be one of the first conifers that come on the scene. Those babies have to grow up in the sunshine. They're not going to do the thing like the Western hemlock, like growing slowly in the shade of other trees. They're going to grow big, fast, and in the sun. And it's pretty awesome. A lot of times if you're out there exploring and it's Doug fir, and then you start to see noble firs, and you're like, oh, and then you look at your map and you're like, oh, sure enough, I'm now at 3,000 feet. We're starting to see, some diversity happening, a lot more conifer diversity. And you're going to see the noble firs joining the Doug firs. Again, not related. Here's those cones. These are pretty big. A couple of those are kind of floppy, but these are about the size of a pineapple. I tend to exaggerate, but I'll stick with pineapple. They're about that shape, maybe a little bit smaller than a full-size pineapple. And if you can see, they have those little bracts in there too. So they have this little, let's find a good one here. Like a little, looks like a little elephant trunk right here is one of the little bracts coming out of the scales. And they've got two little nubs here that I think of as the ears of the elephant. And then here's the little elephant trunk coming out. I don't know. Am I just doodling and making it hard to tell? I don't know. What works for you, go for it. I'm going to call them upright owl cones with elephants. So use the language and whatever like helps you remember it and works for your brain. But yeah, those are those cones that are upright. It's pretty cool. And the needles are pretty rad too. I guess I hadn't mentioned this yet, but a lot of conifers have this, a lot of the field guides call it bloom. It's also known as stomata. They're basically like holes on the bottom of the leaf so the leaf can exchange gases. And most conifers have bloom just on the bottom side. So if you picked a needle off a Doug fir, for example, it'd be dark green on the top and then like kind of more whitish or light green on the bottom side. But in the case of noble fir, they have that bloom or that stomata on the top and the bottom. And a lot of the trees that have the stomata on both sides have more of like a bluish cast to them. So oftentimes when you're seeing noble firs, they'll look really, really bright blue. Or maybe not bright blue, but much bluer than, you know, all the other trees we've talked about thus far. And if you look on the underneath side, they say that the way that the needles are attached have this hockey stick attachment. So they don't just go straight in, they kind of like have that curve on the bottom side of the stem. So the needles are attached like a hockey stick. And here's the tops of the trees. They're really rounded at the top. Like a lot of the other conifers that they're going to be hanging out with, they go to a sharp point. They're going to be triangular at the very top. The noble firs are very round. It's cool if you ever like if you're driving the Mount Hood Highway and you're going like 26, you know, through Government Camp, and then it splits, and you take 35 to Hood River. Just as you go up that road, just kind of look off to your right, and you'll see a lot of these really nice blue rounded tops of the noble firs. And if you're there kind of late summer, like in August or something, you'll see the owls perched up in the tree. I mean, cones. And if you want to see my favorite noble fir, you can go to the, oh, it just fell out of my head. There's that first trail, the first pass, Barlow Pass. If you start at Barlow Pass and hop on the PCT and go like just 100 yards south, there's a giant noble fir right on the trail. It's beautiful. You should go say hi. Cool. So questions on noble fir or anything folks want to share around that?
Susan asked if they needed more water since they have more stomata.
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, it makes sense because they're going to be exchanging more and growing higher up in the mountains, you know, like, you know, generally the season doesn't start as long. So a lot of these trees that are adapted to living higher in the mountains, you know, they're snow melt. So the soil stays moister longer. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I think that's a very fascinating question and definitely worth exploration. I don't know if anybody else has any insights there.
I could be totally wrong, but I think that the stomatal bloom is not necessarily stomata. So if they have more stomatal bloom, that is protecting the stomata from desiccation. So possibly if they have the more white on both sides with stomatal bloom, that's actually signaling that they're in harsher conditions and they need to prevent water loss. But that's just also brainstorming. I have no idea.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, cool. Are there insights or questions? Gosh, time flies, doesn't it? Cool.
Popular Christmas tree.
Yeah, for $7 you can get a tag from the ranger station and go cut yourself down a Christmas tree if you can find one. Good luck.
Yeah. And yeah, people do grow it here in the valley. So as a Christmas tree, or, you could probably, I've seen a few street trees, etc. So it will grow here, but, this is where you're more likely to find it out in the nature. And, of course, there's always those adventurous trees. You'll find a noble fir once in a while at 1,000 feet or something like that in the mountains, but where they become widespread is in that middle elevations, that 2.5, 3,000 feet, depending on the side of the mountain you're on, up to about, 5.5, 6, kind of they're predominant in that area. And this is a Pacific silver fir, and it, like the Western hemlock, is a shade tolerant tree. So the Pacific silver fir is going to bide its time in the shade of the those more sun tolerant trees, just growing slowly, and waiting for disease or whatever to take out the trees above it, and then rise into predominance. Much like the Western hemlock, it's a pretty thin barked tree. So there's another thing as we're pondering, like, what is there a correlation there between shade tolerance and having a thin bark? It's just something that occurred to me when I was putting this together. I don't have any answers there, but this is the stuff that keeps me up at night and I like thinking about. Look at those cones, they're purple. Yeah. So I was so excited when I found this. I am kind of I don't know, my house kind of looks like a weird natural history museum with just like random stuff I find in the forest. And I have quite a collection of cones, and I was really excited to find this cone. But these cones aren't meant to be stored in your home. I put it in the back of my car in the hatch, and it was a pretty warm day. By the time I got home, it had just fallen apart, and it was just scales everywhere. It was kind of a mess. And then, of course, all the resins like melted into the carpet and everything. So, but nonetheless, I was really excited to see them, because generally you're just going to see them, like high up in the tree. But, again, every now and then a careless squirrel might bring one to the ground. And yeah, just bright purple. And, I'd always read that, but it was pretty cool to see. And this is like at maturity. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have any true fir cones that have stuck together in your collection?
No. No, they're just not meant to last. They're not like pine cones or things like that. Yeah, they're pretty fragile affairs. They build them for a season, and they shed those scales off one at a time, just to cast them about. So yeah, I don't know. There's probably fancy ways you could do something to preserve them, but I haven't delved into that. Here's the needles. And so they have two different kinds of needles on them. They have needles that are flat, which is very typical of your shade tolerant plants, right? Really maximizing the amount of sun that you can get. But the Pacific silver firs take it to another level, and that they have these other needles that sit flat against the stem. Like folks say they look like ski jumpers, right? When you go in the air and you kind of stick your head out and your butt back, right? You're kind of at that angle. So they'll have a ski jumper, like one right after another, right? In a line going all the way up the stem. So it's really maximizing the amount of sunshine. Flat needles, and then needles stacked kind of on each other, like barely, I don't know. Picture probably does better than my words are doing right now. But they're just kind of at that little bit of an angle, just running parallel to the stem itself. Just really looks like it's maximizing the potential there. And this one has that new spring growth too. So you can see the dark green from last year, and then that lime green from this year's growth. And if you're ever out, and you sometimes, after a storm or whatever, you can find that on the ground. And those lime green tips of the firs, or a lot of the conifers, again, excluding yew trees, are really quite delicious, really high in vitamin C and really tart. Put some moisture in your mouth. Here's the grand fir. I have probably the least to say about grand fir. They're kind of one of those trees that kind of wherever you go, they're going to be, they say, about 2% of the population. So they're kind of here and there, kind of everywhere. You'll see them at low, middle elevations. Kind of where they're getting a bad rap now is in the Ponderosa pine forests on the east side. And the reasoning there is because Ponderosa pines are one of the trees that, you've probably seen a conifer that's like over on its side, right? And you can see the roots. And it's amazing to see these trees that are like 200 feet tall, and the roots are only going into the earth like 5 feet. And the roots are going more like horizontally. Well, Ponderosa pine is one of the few trees that what it does is sends a taproot to go deep into the soil to look for little pockets of water. And so anyways, in the Ponderosa pine forest, we're seeing a lot of grand fir kind of starting to develop in the understory because of fire suppression. But anyways, the grand fir, because they have that needle and, you know, those roots really close to the surface, they're grabbing all that rainfall as it starts to fall. And now the water's not feeding those underground reservoirs like it once did, right? And so because of that, this is one of the reasons why Ponderosa pine forests are really starting to struggle. It's because grand firs are they're harvesting all that surface water. So it's not recharging the reservoirs that the ponderosas are dependent on. But again, they are a native tree and they have a place in a lot of different ecosystems. But again, they're just kind of a small part of a community of trees. And so, yeah, I don't really fully understand exactly what they're doing. There's their cones. Whoa. There's their cones. Here's those needles. And again, we're seeing this a lot with these shade tolerant species, right? Like a really flat array of needles, right? So we're seeing that here with the grand firs, and we saw that with the, with the hemlock and the Pacific silver firs too. The last thing I'll share about the Abies genus, the true firs, is that they hybridize a lot. So if you're out there exploring and you're like going, oh, this looks like it's got some traits of the grand fir, but it's got traits of the Pacific silver fir too, right? It's got the needles like this, like a grand fir, but it's like a purple cone. You're like, what the heck? It could be a hybrid. So this is a great moment. Your little nerdy botanical cheat thing. You can say Abies SP dot, which means Abies genus, species unknown, and leave it at that, because you could have a hybrid, and you'll see that between the grand fir and the Pacific silver fir on occasion. But yeah, this group is just kind of known for that, known to hybridize. I'm going to jump. I put my slides into two different things. I'm going to move over to that next slide now and open it up to questions regarding anything we've covered thus far.
Are the needles of the grand fir flat?
Yeah, they're really, in like kind of in two planes, really quite flat.
Okay, all right.
There we go.
Curious if you were going to talk about the Sub-Alpine fir.
Oh yeah, maybe we will. Sorry, I was kind of queuing that up. Maybe I got a little ahead of myself. But was there any other questions on true firs or middle elevations in general? So we're going up higher now, traveling up.
Sure, I got a question. This is Benjamin. So as far as impressing our friends when we're going out in the forest, do you have any other tidbits about these other firs, maybe that we could be able to share with them?
Yeah, I would really recommend the Trees to Know in Oregon book. This is a really awesome, user-friendly book. So this probably isn't going to translate. No. Anyways, a lot of botanical books have what we call a key, and it's a lot of technical jargon, and you choose it as like a which way adventure sort of thing. Anyways, this has a really simple to use graph to break down your conifers. And I love this book a lot. It has a lot of really valuable information. It's put out by Oregon State University, and they make a new edition like every couple of years. So you can get fancy and buy the new one with, glossy pictures for like $25, or dig around at Powell's or whatever and find a used copy from 1947. That's, just as good, but it's not going to have any photographs in it. So I highly recommend that book to learn your trees. Yeah. And firs, just that's the hardest group. We're lucky that we just got 3 or 4 of them. If you go into other places like down in Southern Oregon, down in the Siskiyous, it gets even more complicated. So maybe if you're new and want to impress your friends, just avoid firs for a while.
Greg,
cones?
I'm sorry?
Can we see the grand fir cones?
Yeah, the picture was pretty cruddy, but they look really similar to the other two, but they're kind of a greenish color. Sorry, I shut that slide thing down. You could probably Google that and find a nice image though. Sometimes when I'm looking at the small pictures on my thing, they look a lot better than when I put them up for y'all, sorry. Yeah.
Greg asked if grand firs and white firs are the same tree.
No, there's white firs that a little bit south of our range. They might come into Southern Oregon. I've seen them down in like the Russian wilderness down in Northern California. And yeah, get down in there and like Mount Shasta area, and fir trees are complicated. So we're kind of lucky that, you know, our diversity is a little less in that ID respect. Cool. Other questions?
I just would add that a little trick to impress your friends if you wanted one. The grand fir, the needles have like a very citrusy smell. It's really delightful.
Mm-hmm.
And just to talk that tree up just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to be dismissive. I appreciate you sharing that. I just feel like I don't know them as well. And just because they're those plants that you just see in a lot of different areas. And I'm just like, I just haven't figured out the correlation in my brain yet. So ecology wise, I still got a lot to learn with that one, with all of them, but that one in particular. Yeah. Plus, there's so many more trees to talk about. I'll probably move through some of these a little bit quicker just so we could get to the pines. But we've gone up in elevation now, and we're in this place we call Sub-Alpine, or folks call it parkland. And this is maybe 6,000 to 7,000 feet in Mount Hood. And you can see here, like, we're not getting continuous forest. What we're getting is like maybe little islands. So you're like, if you're on a hike, you're like, ooh, I'm in the trees. And then you walk 100 yards and you're like, no, I'm in a meadow. And then you walk a little further and you're like, oh, I'm in the trees again. So it's kind of that broken up landscape. It's where it's we're up high enough and there's snowpack long enough that a lot of the trees that we've been discussing are not going to range up this high. We're going to see different trees such as Engelman Spruce. This tree, I think, like Western Red Cedar, really, really likes it wet. So you'll see it in two of the main places, or high up on the mountain, like, you know, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, say, where basically there's snow on the ground 7, 8 months out of the year, maybe 9 months out of the year. But those soils just never dry out. So this plant has access to moisture year round. Where you will see it occasionally at lower elevations is in wet meadows. If you're in a wet meadow and you start to see what we call tree creep, the wet meadow is starting to shrink because trees are slowly starting to encroach from the forest inwards. You'll see Engelman spruce because it loves wet. And so wet meadows are generally, you know, they're grassy and have herbaceous plants because it's too wet to support most conifers, except Engelman spruce. And here it's joined by another tree that we'll talk about in a minute called Lodgepole Pine. And Lodgepole Pine is the best at growing where no other tree will grow. It's like, oh man, that's a crappy situation. Lodgepole Pine's like, dude, I got this. So if you ever hiking around and you see a community that's Engelman Spruce and Lodgepole Pine, you can be pretty sure that there was once a wet meadow there, because generally those two plants are not hanging out. So anyways, there's a picture of its bark. A lot of folks are familiar with the Sitka spruce. If you had a Sitka spruce and an Engelman spruce in the same room, you'd be hard pressed to figure them out. I would, but unfortunately their ecology is so different. You're like, am I at 6,000 feet on Mount Hood, or is that the ocean right there? If you can answer that question, you'll figure, you know, that's really all you need. Sitka spruce is on the coast, and Engelman spruce is up in our mountains. But they both have this really puzzle piece bark. Here's those cones, really paper thin. And if you look at the edges of the cone, they're really like, they're wavy. They have wavy margins on the scales of the cone. And I've gathered Engelman spruce cones and a Sitka spruce cone and put the two together. And I'm like, really? What do I got here? I couldn't really notice any difference at all. So I'm sure to a more discerning eye, there's something there. But I thought it was pretty neat to see just how close they are by bark, by cone, and by needle. Ouch. A lot of conifers, the needles will come to a tip, but if you bump into a spruce tree, it will stab you. So if you touch a needle and go, it's probably a spruce tree. So they'll say friendly fir and sharp spruce. A lot of the spruce trees are stabby. So be careful. Also, if you took one of those needles and kind of rolled it in your finger, they're four-sided. So if you roll it between your finger, it'd be like da 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 da. You could feel those ridges. So they're four-sided and sharp to the touch with those needles. And the spruce trees too, I couldn't find a good profile picture, so I tried to get this to illustrate it. But all of the tips of the branches, they kind of flop over. So it gives it kind of a droopy appearance. I don't know, this picture doesn't really capture it too well. But notice that on the spruce trees, like a lot of the branches aren't like kind of flipped up like the edges of a Doug fir. They kind of flop over at their very tips. That very like the lateral growth, the very end growth on branches will kind of turn downwards. And then up high, its buddy, Engelman Spruce, is the mountain hemlock, Suga mertensiana. A little bit of a thicker bark than the western hemlocks down below. But, you know, not super thick. You know, the Engelman Spruce and the mountain hemlock are growing higher up in the mountains where fire is less of a risk. I know we've had a couple up in Mount Hood pretty high in the last decade. But, you know, overall, these are in pretty snowy areas where it's just the soils don't dry out a lot. And again, those trees are not in contiguous forests. They're kind of in little isolated things. So, you know, maybe evolving for fire wasn't as much of a thing. So yeah, a little bit thicker bark. The cones are very similar to Suga heterophylla, western hemlock down below. But these are about 3 times as long and a little bit more oval shaped. So western hemlocks are maybe like, I don't know, 1/2 inch, and these are maybe 1 inch long, inch and change. And they will have a droopy leader like the western hemlock, because that's a Suga thing. All hemlock, or yeah, all hemlock trees have that. But look at those needles. Most years, like noble firs are my favorite, but I might change it up this year. I think it might be mountain hemlock. They're like blue stars. All the needles are the same length, like unlike, I should say, the western hemlock. It's pretty uncommon to see the two growing in the same ecosystem. I mean, you'll find it from time to time, but you know, if you're below 5,000 feet, it's probably a western hemlock. If you're above 5,000 feet, it's probably a mountain hemlock, but you know, of course, there's some variability there. But anyways, the needles are arranged around the stem like a bottle brush, kind of similar to what the Doug firs have going on, but they have the bloom on both sides like noble firs. So they give it that kind of bluish cast. Really just a gorgeous tree. And then, yeah, that droopy leader too. Oops, don't have any pictures of the droopy leader. But yeah, so the top's just gonna be a little flipped over, not erect. And yeah, and up pretty high on the mountains. I've never experienced this before, but I've heard like the hemlock trees are really good at layering. So you could take a branch and like dig a little hole and like put it under the soil and they could grow another baby plant. So that's another way you can propagate them is via layering. Suga in Japanese means mother tree, and I think it reflects part of that. So the branches are really pliable, especially on the mountain hemlock, because they're just used to getting like inundated with snow, right? And so I've heard tell of like sometimes they can get totally so much snow on them, it'll pretty much bury the tree and they'll kind of fall over on their side. And then as the snow melts, the tree will just, it'll flip to the side and like fling snow in the air, which I've always thought sounded pretty cool to witness. It almost makes me want to put on snowshoes again. But yeah, probably also a little danger with that. Cool. The other fir that we've got, Sub-Alpine fir, really a long or a tall, slender thing. Only going to get about maybe 80, 100 feet tall and not very wide. So this is a pretty useful design if you're going to be growing up pretty high in the subalpine and alpine areas. A good way to shed snow. You know, if you're not designed to do that hemlock thing, if you're pretty slender, it's hard for snow to kind of build up on your upper branches and weigh you down. Then here's those needles. Probably won't see too much of this like doing bark type stuff, but Every now and then they'll have some timber sales that are up around 6,000 feet, and you might start to see them. But yeah, I think they range, in my experience, a little bit higher than, say, the mountain hemlock and the Engelman spruce. But yeah, there's the needles, bloom on both sides, so kind of a bluish cast to them. And then you get up really high into the alpine area, and you find those gnarly trees with just like, it's like 90% dead, and there's like a little tuft of like 5 leaves at the end, and it's like 1,000,000 years old. That's probably a white bark pine. And so you're going to get up. Now we're in alpine. So now these trees are going to be alone. They might be 30 foot tall, look kind of bonsai'd. My favorite place to go see them is up around Cloud Cap. It's one of the highest places you can camp up on Mount Hood. It's like 7,000 feet or something. That road sucks, so have good clearance or whatever if you're going to go up there, or you can take the Tilly Jane Trail up there. But one of the coolest experiences I had was hiking up there, and it was a full moon, and in the alpine area it was just like glowing. It was like blue, just glow, and we were hiking around and like looking at all these white bark pines, and it was just freaking magic. So I've got a fondness around these trees, and these are in the pine group, which we're going to segue into now. We've gone east. You guys exhausted from all this like traveling we're doing? Whew. We were just 7,000 feet on Mount Hood, and now we've gone like 20 miles east. We're in the rain shadow, right? All that moisture coming off the coast, all that moisture-laden clouds. They have to climb, push their way up Mount Hood, and they get heavy, low clouds, bumping into high clouds, and they drop all that moisture right on Mount Hood, on the west side of Mount Hood. And so when those clouds start to move across the east side of the mountain, they got nothing left, or very little left. So now we've moved from like, Mount Hood, maybe 60, 80 inches of rain or something. Now we're like looking at 20 inches of rain. So things are remarkably drier. And we can see maybe it's like, this picture's really terrible, sorry. But it's a much more open forest. There's like maybe more grass, like yarrow, balsam root, plants in the understory like that. Trees are much more spread out. And oh no, this tree's dying. Or is it?
We got some chats saying it's fall and that larches are the only deciduous conifers.
Don't forget about tamarack.
Yeah. And yeah, that would be another name for these, especially if folks are on the East Coast, like a lot of the trees there will go by the name tamarack, and you'll still see that applied to our trees, whatever here. But Western larch is another name for them too. If you want to get super fancy pants, you can say Larix officinalis or occidentalis. So just so you can make sure you're talking about the right plant. But yeah, these will get beautiful colors in the fall. These are one of the conifers that shed their needles in the winter. So after you're done, on like that drive I was talking about, Highway 35, and you've noticed all the owls perched on the round tops of the blue noble firs, keep driving towards Hood River. And then you go past the ski resort there, Mount Hood Meadows, and then you start to go downhill, and all of a sudden you'll start to see larch trees. And if you take that drive like in October, it'll just be beautiful seeing all these large trees. They're also really stunning when they start to leaf out too. But yeah, the larch or the tamarack trees are one that are deciduous. And probably one of the most fire resistant barks out there too, or fire resistant trees. Really thick bark like a Doug fir. And it's funny, I wish I had a picture of the profile because they're the fastest growing trees too, which I was surprised to learn. They can grow well over a foot a year. So they can grow really fast, which is kind of remarkable too, that they grow on that drier east side forest. But they got a really thick bark, and they're often, if you have a 200-foot tree, it's often like 170 feet before you start to see branches. It looks like just a tiny shrub on like a giant. Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating tree, being deciduous, super fire resistant. I should add there on its ecology, while they do grow on the east side with like the Ponderosa Pines and such, they do like the wet microclimates on the east side. So if you have a mountain, they're going to be more on the north side where they're not getting the direct sunshine, right? Then on the south side, you might see those drier species. Or maybe they're a little closer to a creek or in a little gully, like in a low spot in a landscape.
I had a question. What time of year exactly, like what month do the larches get their needles back?
That's a good question. May is what I wanted to say, and then I'm like, am I just saying something? So I don't know. Does anyone else have a good idea there?
I definitely don't know for sure, but I was in the Hoyt Arboretum last weekend and I saw some that were starting to leaf a little bit. So
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I was thinking more up in the mountains, but it makes sense. They'd be leafing out here now. Yeah. So the larch trees have a really interesting needle pattern too. All along the branch, there's these little like barrels, right? And then from each of these little barrels, you'll see a spray of like 20 needles coming out. So the larch have this really interesting pattern. And oftentimes, if you're looking under a larch tree, the twigs are really distinct too, where you'll see those little, it almost looks like they're like really knobby on the twigs. And that's the remnants of those little barrels, which those 20 needles arise from. We'll see something kind of similar with pines here in a minute. And then here we are again, another cone that has a little scale, a little bract that comes out between the scales. And these just have a single thing. You know, the Doug fir, we saw have the 3-pronged deal. And these ones just have one little tongue that comes out from each little bract. And then again, the seeds are going to be wedged there in between. Really pretty tree. You'll see these a lot. And again, on the east side forest where we're at and kind of in the transitional zones, you'll see them a little bit, you know, as we're kind of moving between the west side forest and the east side forest. And then who we're really going to see out on the east side are members of the Pinus genus, the true pines, the ones that actually have pine cones. So yeah, a lot of the pines we'll see on the east side, pretty convenient in our area. We just got 3. But pines have long needles and packets. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like next, but it's similar. It's kind of like a simpler version of what the larch was doing. They have hard woody scales, woody cones, excuse me. If you ever pick up a pine cone and you get stabbed, it's probably a pine, a member of the pine genus. Oftentimes the edge of that scale kind of hooks up like a rose thorn, and they can be a little stabby. If you're looking at the profile of a pine tree, and I think I've got a picture of that coming up too, they're very airy. They're like little pom-poms, like on sticks. Not a good shade tree, right? This is not a place to like chill out and take a nap. A lot of sunlight is getting underneath them. In our areas, in pines in general, the needles can range from 1 to 5 per packet, but it's kind of cool in our area, leaving aside the white bark pines at 8,000 feet. There's 1 2-needle pine, 1 3-needle pine, and 1 5-needle pine. So that's a great way to at least get started figuring out your pines. How many needles do they have per packet? If you're working with a botanical key, that's going to be the first question you encounter. And then I'll pick up that last thing here at the graphic in a minute. But here's the fascicle. If you plucked a needle off, it would come off with a friend or 4. And as you plucked it off, you would see that there's like a papery sheath holding them together. That's what I was referring to there with that fascicle. That's a very pine thing. People will say that the common thing there is pines and packets. That works for you. Here it is cheering with its little pom-poms. So you can kind of see underneath that, you know, not a lot of shade there to be had. It's a very airy, kind of open expression with a lot of the pines. And this is kind of cool. The pine trees put on a whirl of branches per year. And so, you know, if you're ever out exploring, we use this a lot, like if you're, you know, if the Forest Service is saying, well, this place is really great for growing trees or whatever, you can just look at some of those younger pine trees and see like how close are those whorls apart, right? Are they 2 inches or are they a foot apart, right? So this can give you an idea of like how well the soils are, things like that. Or if you're like looking at a stand of young trees and you're like, how long ago did a fire go through here? Or when was this clear cut? You can count each of these little whorls and get an idea of how old the trees were. Maybe add another year or 2 for them to get established. Once the trees are like 20 years old, this doesn't work. These branches, or the trees, excuse me, will start to shed these lower branches when they're no longer productive for them. So, maybe 20, 30 years down the road, this isn't a useful tool. But if you're trying to catch the age on a younger stand, like this is pretty cool. Doug firs will do this as well. Here's the Western white pine. It has really pretty bark too. It reminds me a lot of noble fir, kind of in this puzzle piece kind of pattern. Coloration is about the same. And if you're ever out exploring and you find a banana on the floor, it's probably this cone. They've got that nice curvature. They're about 8 inches long and great for fake telephone calls, whatever you need to do. Just be careful. As you can see on this cone, there's all the resin in there. And I get a little nerdy when I'm doing plant ID stuff. And then I get excited to pretend like that's a phone. And then all that resin gets in my beard and stuff. And it's kind of annoying. So be careful. Banana phoning it. Sorry, I'm getting loopy. The needles are in packets, again, as all pines are, but the Western white pine are in packets of 5. So in Mount Hood, this gets pretty convenient. Like I said earlier, there's a 2, 3, and a 5 needle pine, and the Western white pine is our 5 needle pine in our area. Not super clear in this picture, but Western white pine does have a bluish cast to it too. So like the noble fir, like the Engelman spruce, they're going to have a little bit of a bluish color to them. And they're in a lot of trouble right now. A lot of the 5 needle pines are. There is a disease out there. And if you want to dig into this, this is a really interesting organism. But this is the white pine blister rust. It at first attacks a currant, and then it metamorphosizes into this other thing. And then it attacks the needles of a 5 needle pine. And then it metamorphosizes again and like somehow gets into the bark. And when it releases its spores, it's all like aliens bursting out. Like it just cracks open the bark to release the spores. Yeah, anyways, it's a pretty fascinating organism. It has a lot of different lifestyles. It wiped out a lot of the eastern white pines, and now it's moving west to the western white pines. Even up high, the white bark pines at like 7,000 feet. Global warming is happening to such an effect that now the disease is getting up there. It wasn't but a few years ago where it was too cold for the pine blister rust to be. But it's moving there, and it's moving south, and we're seeing it in sugar pine now too. So this thing is devastating 5 needle pines, and that's sad. In Mount Hood National Forest, they are gathering seeds from trees that seem to be resistant, or at least old trees that aren't getting the disease, and gathering seeds from them. And they have a nursery just designed for trying to keep this tree alive on the mountain. Lodgepole pines, the coolest, pretty thin barked. Here's their cones, very oval shaped like that, kind of come to a point. They'll often stay on the tree for quite some time. Sometimes they do this thing called their serotinous, which basically means they have so much resin around the cones that they'll stay on the wood until fire melts that resin away to release the seeds, right? So sometimes those cones will, they'll stay attached to the tree for many, many years. You'll see this pattern a lot with the fire adapted species in the pine genus. These kind of cones that stay on the tree for some time. Pretty small, maybe an inch or 2 across. There are 2 needle pine, and there again is those male cones, those staminate cones releasing pollen. And the lodgepole pines have 2 needles per packet. And lodgepole pines grow pretty big, pretty fast, and they die young. So when we're talking about succession, these are one of the first trees that come up on the scene. So you'll see, like, especially after a major fire that wipes out a large area, or, epic clear cut, you'll see these dog hair stands of lodgepole pine. And so the lodgepole pines move in, and it just becomes nothing but lodgepole pine, right? And then comes along the pine beetle, and this is one of their favorite snacks, because they'll just be like, a lot of areas of Mount Hood, there'll just be acres and acres and acres of it. So then you get the pine beetle comes in and starts to wipe them out. And I've seen this a lot. There was a sale we were working on with Barc called Limiti down near the Olali Lakes area. And there was lodgepole pine and they were all dying and they were all getting attacked by this beetle. And they're like, oh my God, we gotta log it because, it was a fire risk and because all these trees are diseased. But it's just what happens when things get old, right? We get older, we're more prone to get a disease. And these beetles, they help decay the tree, they invite habitat for woodpeckers, etc. But what was really sad was underneath all the lodgepole pines, you could see the next wave of plants coming in. There was Doug fir, there was true firs, there was mountain hemlocks. I think in one area, in one of the units they were looking to log, we counted 12 different species of trees in the understory of these lodgepole pines. And so, yeah, it's true. The lodgepole pine, there's going to be a period of time where it's a bit of a fire risk. But if we log all the lodgepole pine, we're going to destroy all that diversity that's coming up underneath the lodgepole pine. And guess what's going to come back? More lodgepole pine. So yeah, we would just be stuck in this situation. And it was really sad for me because they were going to burn that wood for biofuels. And to be honest, I don't know what came of that sale. I should look into that.
So as far as the rust on the other tree and on the white pine and then the beetles for this one, has anything been developed to, ward against these pests invading the trees? Because I know the pine bug is really prominent in the Sierra Nevadas in California and has already destroyed over 60% of the lodgepole pine up there. So
Yeah.
what can be done to ward off these pests? And are they invasive? Were they brought in from somewhere else?
My understanding is that they're endemic, but normally we would have really cold winters and that would keep populations in check. And because of climate change and temperatures warming, we're not getting that check on their population. So they can kind of just keep at it all winter long. So I'm not familiar. Yeah, I would have to do more research on that. Like what are some things that people are doing about this critter? Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has more to share on that.
There's also some research. This beetle is endemic to this area. And there's been some research that suggests that the beetle outbreaks act to make the forests more adaptive to a new climate. So forests that are struggling or trees that are struggling in the warmer, drier environments are often killed by the beetle. And that helps the forests in this new drier, warmer climates. So a lot of timber sales are focused on preventing outbreaks, but outbreaks might be advantageous for the forests.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's so much we just see the destruction in the moment and forget ecologies and ecosystems work in a really long pattern. And I mean, really with lodgepole pine, as I mentioned earlier, it takes a tree as long to live as it does to die. And so 80 years, like if you live for 80 years, like that means 80 years down the road, this lodgepole pine is soil. And that's really quick in terms of succession. And so, maybe they're coming in and, there seems like there are a lot of them and they're getting diseases, et cetera. But yeah, it could be exactly what the forest needs. Is just that input of organic matter. Yeah.
Just a quick mention that white pine blister rust is a non-native, actually.
Yes.
And I think that one of the reasons why it's been so successful is because it can, it's a complex life cycle that can exist on ribes like currants and gooseberries for many years. So it can just kind of hang out in the ribes plant tissue, and whenever there's appropriate moisture or whatever, it can then attack the 5-needle pines.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I'm sorry if I misspoke on that one. And yeah, because I remember for a while, like one of the management things was to eradicate all currants. There was some forests that were experimenting with that. Yeah, so that's a sad one. And that would be something that would be worthwhile to look into, prevention there. Thus far, I've just heard of trying to retain trees and collect seeds from those that seem to be less susceptible to it. Yeah. But yeah, lodgepole pines are really great. If I had more time, I would share more, but they really grow where no other tree can. So these lodgepole pines that we're talking about are east side of Mount Hood, but this is the same species type that we call shore pine. This is Pinus contorta, variety contorta, and they're the ones that look all like crazy windswept bonsai looking things, right there right on the coast, getting blasted by wind and salt. And then up here in the mountains, they're Pinus contorta variety latifolia, and they generally just grow really, really straight up. So it's cool. They're really, really adaptable. Like I said, they can grow wet meadows. They can grow in really, really dry situations. You'll see them growing in frost pockets where like the ponderosas can't really grow. Good stuff. Speaking of ponderosa, here's that nice pumpkiny orange bark of the Ponderosa pines. If you ever get a chance, like one of my, there's a professor who used to teach at PSU named Trygve Steen, and he would always talk about Ponderosa pine and how they get this like pumpkin orange color on their 80th birthday. And he shared like going out with some that wanted to log in this area because they thought it was going to be highly productive. And he found this Ponderosa pine that in his telling was like the size of his leg, and yet it was like pumpkin orange already. And so when they did like a little core sample, like drilled a hole into it to count the tree rings, indeed it was over 80 years in age. And that pumpkin orange color attested to it. And being that it was that small and 80 years in age, probably was a good indication that that was not great soil for growing Ponderosa pine, or, you know, to make that ecosystem into a tree plantation or what have you. So I always think about that when I think about Ponderosa pine and getting their orange jacket on their 80th birthday. And here's their cones. Bunch of them. They're pretty big, stout affairs, as a lot of pine cones are, and they're a little stabby. So if you're gathering those for your collection, do be careful. They do have like a little kind of rose prickle thing at the tip of those scales. And they're a 3-needle pine, really, really a long, long needled pine. And yeah, this is going to be the dominant tree if you're out there on the east side of Mount Hood. You're probably, you might see some Doug fir, larch plants, trees like that in that community, but that's really the domain of the Ponderosa pine in these open pine forests, really grassy areas. Out in the far east side of Mount Hood, they're often hanging out with Gary oak, Quercus garryana. That's his buddy out there. And really a fire adapted tree. They say in most Ponderosa pine forests, a lot of those forests would experience fire every 20 years or so. So yeah, so this is an ecosystem that needs some help because of Smokey the Bear and all that stuff. And then there's juniper. Too much of this on Mount Hood, but if you got to the very, very east side of Mount Hood or some really gnarly rocky ridges on the east side of Mount Hood, you might see some junipers, and you might go, those don't look like pine cones, because junipers make those little berries. And there's that scaly look that we saw with the Western Red Cedar, a close relative of theirs. And I am done. I will leave it for questions now. I'm sorry. Oh, wait, I didn't go over. It's 8:30. But I can linger for a little bit for questions, but I just wanted to wrap it up so that if folks needed to be on to other things, that we could end this thing on time.
Sophie asked, this is not related to any specific tree, but what kinds of trees drop off their bottom branches? That they said they were in the Tillamook National Forest recently and were wondering.
Yeah, so I think a lot of trees, it's just, especially if they're, shade intolerant trees, just as they continue to grow higher, those lower branches get shaded out, and the plant will just shed them. Or those lower branches will like go really, really far wide looking for sunshine. And so they're just more suspect to like maybe that windstorm we had. I know out where I live, a lot of those lower branches came off in the storm because they tended to be much longer trying to find the sunshine. So yeah, I wouldn't be too worried if it's the lower branches. I think that's pretty common for most conifers to be shedding them.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I came in a little late, so you might have covered it. So my apologies if you did. but what are the names of the trees at the coast when you're in certain areas and they just look wind torn? I know that most of them are like blown in the same direction, and then
Yeah.
the bark is like really like not even there sometimes. What trees what is the name of those trees, if you please?
Sometimes spruce will have that, but probably what you're looking at is a shore pine. This is Pinus contorta. And that's the same one the same one we were just talking about, the lodgepole pine, that up here in the mountains, they're really these tall, slender things, but on the coast, they're usually pretty gnarly looking, kind of look like bonsai trees, all the growth is kind of wind sheared. Yeah. I think of lodgepole pine as like, they're the tree that grows where no other trees can do it. So they're really adapted and kind of step into those ecological niches that other plants are like, no way.
Okay, so like shore pine then?
That would be my guess. Sometimes you'll see some Sitka spruce doing that too, but shore pines are really, really resilient and then can take all that salt spray.
Okay, wonderful. And I know that there's a few of the new growth on some of these pines that you can actually eat. And I don't know if you went into any of that.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, just to get to know you trees, YEW, the Taxus genus, because those are toxic. And there's some plants like juniper and Western red cedar, which are, they're not toxic per se, but they've got a lot of complex chemistry in them. So a lot of those resins are so dense, they can be hard on your kidney in excess. But things like the true firs and hemlocks and Doug firs, you can eat those little tips. But again, just really do get to know the Western yew trees, because that could be a life or death sort of thing.
All right, thank you.
Yep, of course.
Amanda asked, do you have a book suggestion for learning about the relationships between trees and mushrooms?
Is there a good book out there? Probably if I wasn't tired from talking for 2 hours, I would be able to think of the name. There's a couple books out there that do cover that. This is kind of the emerging science. What is coming to me right now, there's a scientist named Suzanne Simard, and I would just check out her. She has a couple like TED Talks, and those are phenomenal. She's an excellent presenter. And the second one, she relates her stories of forest ecology to her battle with cancer, and it's just like, bleh, it's so good. You'll lose your shit in the best way.
Sophie asked if you could go a tiny bit into cedar versus sequoias versus redwoods.
Yeah, I guess they're all closely related. They're all in a group that sometimes is called the false cedars. So yeah, the Western red cedars are the ones that are in our area. But to tell them apart is mostly, I would just go by ecology, really. Like if you're in the coast in Southern Oregon and Northern California, you're going to be in the terrain of the redwoods with their little tiny cones and more like a true needle sort of thing. And then sequoias are going to be like higher up in the Sierras and kind of have more of that, the look like we're seeing here in this juniper kind of, and like the Western red cedar. Yeah. So yeah, I would go with ecology is going to be quite different. They're pretty in very different regions. And yeah, the needle structure is going to be different, cones as well. And yeah,
there used to be more range for those. There were definitely groves of Western red cedar and sequoias, and the Southern Oregon region at one point. But we cut down most of our sequoias in the Oregon, and they haven't quite made any recovery in some of their older growth areas.
Yeah, and you could find all those at the Arboretum too, to get to study those, because they're common they're commonly planted here. They grow pretty well here as well.
Yeah, and next to each other sometimes. Leach Botanical also is a wonderful place. If anybody hasn't had the time to visit Leach Botanical in Southeast, they have a redwood there. They have several Western red cedars. It's a wonderful place to visit if you want to work on identifying conifers and you don't want to walk all over the Arboretum. It's a much shorter walk in a smaller park.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you so much, Gradey, for sharing all this knowledge. All the pictures and the stories were really wonderful and engaging. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to stop the recording now. I will send a follow-up email. We have a recording of this so you can share it. Listen to it again before you go out to ID some trees. And thanks for joining. Hope you all have a good night.